You're listening to Gen XP. Let's talk games.
Gen XP, take one.
So should we talk about why we're here, though? We're doing interviews of each of us at the beginning of our podcast to kind of give an idea of where each of us is coming from and just let our listeners know a little bit more about us before we start really getting into playing games or sharing our opinions on those games. So, my name's Guy. I'm going to be the first interview. So, my friends Alyn and Ryan are going to be giving me some questions. So, let's go.
All right, I'm Ryan. I will start out with the first question. What is your favorite genre or setting for storytelling? Not just in RPGs. It could be novels, films, video games, or some other media. Is it sci-fi or fantasy, futuristic or historical, advanced or primitive, some mixture of these elements, or something completely different? Do you have an example of that as well?
Right. So, when I was a kid, I was 100% fantasy. I was sword and sorcery. I grew up with Conan the Barbarian, Dragonlance novels. I was all about Dungeons and Dragons at that time. When I got to really adulthood and started having kids, I started reading more urban fantasy, which still is fantasy, but it's in a very different setting. I do like sci-fi, but it's not usually been my go-to. I think more along the lines of urban fantasy than fantasy at this point. So I really like the mixture of modern day aesthetics and tropes with magic and the bizarre.
Was there
an example?
Something that...
So, my favorite urban fantasy is a series of books by Jim Butcher named it's the Dresden series, where he talks about a modern day wizard who is a kind of like a private eye, but so it mixes very the detective noir feel with fantasy. So he solves problems that are both, somebody's got a stalker and they're trying to figure that out. Somebody's husband is missing and trying to figure that out. And sometimes it's a normal thing and sometimes it's demons and possession. I really like that very seamless blending of mixing a modern setting with some of the sensibilities that I grew up on in those fantasy novels. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Cool.
Good books, too.
They are good books. I'm behind on them, but I need to get caught up.
I'm not. Someday Butcher's going to come out with the next one.
Right.
Someday. Can't wait either. So, based on that, Guy, you told us a little bit about your preferences and settings, but, so do you prefer being a dungeon master, like a game master, a storyteller type, or do you prefer playing?
I'm going to sound silly on all of these if I say both, but I think when I was younger, I would have said that I preferred to play, but I usually dungeon mastered. Or most of the time I felt like I was dungeon mastering. And I was good with that, but I always felt like I wanted to play more. Now, I don't think I do have a preference anymore. I have been working a lot on the concept of storytelling, and I think maturity and adulthood have also kind of got me to the point where I understand that I'm telling a story regardless of which side of the game master screen I'm sitting on. So I like them both, to be honest. I don't know if that I have a preference, honestly, between the two of them anymore. They're fun. It's fun to tell stories no matter what.
All right. Do you have a favorite video game that would fall into the RPG category? And what is it and why?
Yeah, so in the RPG category, if we're talking about a single-player game, which I go back and forth on this kind of a question because there are RPG games out there like Final Fantasy where you're a whole party of characters. But for me, the really good RPG is a single player or a single character, so you're that character for a little bit. And I would honestly say Cyberpunk, which is funny because I said that I was not so much a sci-fi or futuristic, but the Cyberpunk game, once you got past the opening on rails tutorial that every game seems to want to make you go through, and you were just allowed to be in the city and drive around and talk to people and do random things, I never wanted that part to end. Like, I was really bummed out at the end of that game when I finished the game, and I was ridiculously overpowered when I got there. But I did. I just loved feeling like I could go anywhere in the city and do anything at any time I wanted to without any rail or wall popping up. And of course there's story elements to it, but that game felt very free. As far as multi characters, I love Final Fantasy Tactics, but I don't know if that counts as RPG. Mostly because it's a tactical game more than a role-playing game. But yeah, those would be what I would list as my favorites.
Good choices.
Thanks. Oh, I would say Final Fantasy 1 as well. Way back in the day on the original NES system, just the 4 players, or the 4 characters that you could choose, which was a huge difference than the current Final Fantasy games, like where you're just told, here's your characters, now play. I used to think it was very fun to start over in that game over and over and over again and play, like, this time it's going to be 4 fighters, and this time it's going to be 2 fighters and a black wizard and a white wizard, and it's just that was a very fun aspect of it. But single player, Cyberpunk.
All right. So to step away from RP for a little bit, I know you're an avid board game player and collector. So what would be your favorite board game, and what is it that you like about them, or is there like a style of board game you like as opposed to another style?
My favorite board game would be Root, which is a woodland war game. It's what I like about it, and part of what makes it my favorite is I like asymmetric games, which is probably also why I like dungeon mastering and playing as much as I do, because they're different games, but you're all playing at the same table. But an asymmetric board game is where not everybody is playing the same rule set, and in Root you're basically playing small woodland creatures that are at war with each other, cats versus birds versus a rebel faction. I love the artwork. I love it's a simple game once you know how to play, but it is a complex game, much like I think chess. Chess is simple to know the way the pieces move, but it's a game that you could play for your whole life and get better and better and better at it. So that's definitely my favorite game, board game of all time, is Root.
All right. How do you feel about the shift from standard tabletop to virtual tabletop?
So I prefer in-person gaming, just because the feeling of sitting at a table with your friends and laughing and joking and seeing their facial reactions, seeing their body language, throwing dice, seeing people's genuine just vibe in the room when you do something. If you roll a nat 20, if you fail a savings throw, you can't really duplicate that online. You don't get quite the same thing. There's also like the idea of, if we're playing in an online environment and I'm talking to you, Ryan, and Alyn wants to talk to Tony on the side, at a table we could do that, and it doesn't disrupt everything. When you're in a Zoom meeting or Teams or whatever, and multiple people are talking, it just gets muddy immediately, and you just don't get quite the same thing. And people are muted usually, so you're not hearing things. Sometimes you're only seeing people's faces. All of that being said, as much as I love playing at a table with people, the ease and the convenience that online offers is something that I can't ignore. Like, not all of us live within close proximity to each other anymore. We have childhood friends that we've always played with, that some of them live, 1,000 miles away. Some of them are several hours away. But regardless, the tabletop experience is outside the realm of possibility when it comes to all of us anymore, except for when we can go virtual. So having that virtual option, while it is not as rewarding as sitting at the table, it is something that I am very grateful for. Honestly, it's something that, because we have friends, Gary and Tony, that I probably would have never been able to play with again based on how far away they lived. There'd probably be no chance that we'd ever play a game again. So yeah, I do really appreciate the virtual that is there, but I prefer that we could all sit together.
So, what's your favorite RP system? Is it D&D, or is it a narrative-driven system, or even something else?
So right now, of the games that I've played, I've got some on my shelf that I haven't played yet. But of the games that I've played, I honestly think that I like Root RPG best. I have like 36 years worth of D&D experience. And I do love D&D, and I've played every edition that has ever come out. But ever since I started playing the narrative-focused games, Root being the first one that we really dove into, where you can play the woodland character and the story is king more than the rule set, that really sparked something in me where I want to be able to tell those stories and explore those aspects of character or world that D&D or any game that is built on a more firm rule set doesn't necessarily stop you from doing, but it also doesn't have the rule set built out for that. So I guess that's a hard way to describe it, but where D&D has rules for how far you can walk when it's raining and you're encumbered, it has rules for how much weight you can pick up. It has rules for what this poison does to you. It doesn't really have rules on how people feel about something, or when people are off camera or out of the scene, what are they doing? And I'm not saying that the narrative games have that as well, or instead, but because D&D has so many rules in place, and then there's blank spots where I want to tell those stories, it feels like you run off the rails all of a sudden with D&D, whereas with the narrative games, because they are loose and they flow, when you decide to do something that is a little bit out of left field, like if you wanted to, have a session where you go to the tavern and you just schmooze people, there's nothing in the vibe or the theme of those games that would butt up against the rules. Whereas when you're a dungeon master running D&D and you say, okay, what do you guys want to do? And all of your characters go to the bar and want to schmooze, it leaves the DM with less footing than normal when they're normally running an exploration game or a combat game, or even a straight up role-playing game, which is rare, to be honest. So yeah, my short answer is I like the narrative games. Right now I like Root. I'm looking forward very much to playing Blades in the Dark, Fate, and Scum and Villainy.
Okay, so regarding combat systems in tabletop role-playing games, with D&D we began with Theater of the Mind, and we were pushed towards mini-based tactical combat. Now that the options have opened up with so many RPGs and to choose from, do you find yourself leaning toward one or the other as a preference? And is there a specific example or favorite system that you're aware of?
So we did start with Theater of the Mind, and I remember when we were kids sometimes feeling like that was kind of clunky, not understanding spatial awareness or where somebody was. But I think that was more the the fault of our age than the theater of the mind. I really enjoyed tactical combat when it first showed up in third edition or 3.5 when they added in the grid map, and they massively expanded combat for D&D to include all of the rules like flanking and opportunity attacks and how far everybody can move in a specific round. Loved it, but it does slow things down a lot. So when you're in a combat in Dungeons and Dragons, even a normal combat, let's say there's 4 players and 4 monsters, you can probably guess that combat's going to take about an hour. And it's probably only going to be like 3 rounds at most. Most combat doesn't go much more than 3 to 5 rounds. So because of that, I feel like that chews up a huge amount of your game session. And we've talked about it before, but never on a podcast before. But it feels like Dungeons & Dragons Combat is a different game than Dungeons & Dragons Not Combat. So that being said, I really have been enjoying the narrative games that we've been playing to be able to just describe what happens. And I think that with where we're at right now in our gaming careers, being able to describe something comes easier to us. I don't think that we're in as big of a hurry. I think we can slow down, describe the layout or the room or the positioning a lot more. And I feel like that makes the combat feel richer as well. When you describe how somebody swings the sword, you describe, them swinging on a rope, which simple things like you'd see in a swashbuckler movie, you really don't do in combat in D&D because the grid doesn't really figure those things out. Like, there's no I run up the wall and jump on the chandelier and swing across and drop kick the guy, because the rules are too tight to try to account for every possible thing. But by loosening them up and having less, I feel like it makes for a more rich combat.
So you're more theater of the mind then?
I think I'm more theater of the mind, yeah. I like that. I still enjoy both, but to be honest, when it comes to tactical combat, I would rather play like Malifaux or Warhammer and just play the combat game and forget about the rest of it. Like, it's neat to have a storyline for Malifaux or Warhammer or whatever tabletop mini combat game you want to play. We played Hordes and War Machine for a while as well. Those were very fun, and they scratch the itch of tabletop tactical combat much more than I feel D&D does for me. A lot of times it feels like D&D tactical combat is just, it's formulaic almost. Like, it's my turn, I'm going to move, I'm going to attack, I'm going to use a bonus action, and then I'm going to be done. I'm going to wait to see if I can use my reaction. But it doesn't feel very flavorful.
Can I ask a different question?
Yeah, you can ask whatever. Yeah, we did kind of have an idea of what sort of questions we wanted to ask, because we didn't want to sound like we were completely lost, but we can definitely improv whenever we want. So go for it.
No, but it segues right into what you were saying. That's why. So you said D&D isn't more flavorful, and that's why you like the narrative games, because you feel like you're locked into a combat system. But why can't we expand on D&D combat and make it your own homebrew, for lack of a better way? Or I guess the question I really want to ask is, how would you change D&D to make the combat system more to your theater of the mind narrative and less of that formulaic style that you just talked about?
Sure. So that is not new. It's not a new concept. I mean, it is for me to talk about, but I've heard other people talk about it. So I'm going to quote other people, because I think that is ground that has been well tread. First of all, I think you can take 5th edition, which is the current D&D before they release whatever the one is. But I think you can take 5th edition back to Theater of the Mind if you really want to. It requires buy-in from both the game master as well as the players. And you have to be willing to scrap a lot of rules, because there are basically any spatial awareness rules you have to be able to scrap. But the way that I've seen it done that I've appreciated the most is common sense things like, we're going to have 3 ranges. We're going to have close, which means that you can fight somebody with hand-to-hand weapons. We're going to have near, which means you could probably move to them and fight them right away. And then we're going to have far, which means they're too far away to get to in a short period of time. It would take you a few rounds to get to them. So they're probably going to be a ranged attack. That stuff works, to me, amazingly well to simplify a lot of things. Where you run into problems in D&D is it's hard to not nerf certain classes when you take the tactical battle map out of the game. Like if you're a spellcaster, an arcane spellcaster, and you can throw fireballs, you want to know as that caster specifically how many things can I hit with that fireball. And it just requires both you and the game master to be real honest about it and say, yes, these many people can fit in that space. But I think where I run into problems is you could change D&D in its current form dramatically in order to make it more of a theater of the mind, more of a narrative game. But it's kind of like reinventing the wheel. If there are other games out there that do it and do it the way that maybe that not, here's the thing is, if this is just me, then it's something that I would lean towards. It doesn't have to be everybody, but if everybody said, hey, we all like this system, how do we make D&D more like it? Should we make D&D more like it, or should we just adopt a new system and see what we get? There are lots of 5th edition mods. There's a 5th edition Star Wars mod where you can play straight up Star Wars with 5th edition rules, and there's an appeal to that, because that's taking what everybody knows. I think the biggest draw for D&D right now is that it is the familiar. So if you, in this room we all know it, but if you went to Gen Con or you went to anywhere where there were other like-minded gamer people, 90 to 95% I imagine are going to be familiar with D&D. So if you were to try to find a new game group, finding a new D&D game group is really easy. You can look online at places like Start Playing, and it's not hard to find a D&D group. It's a little difficult to find things like Blades in the Dark or Fate because it's just not the norm. So D&D has become like this, they're the Kleenex or the Band-Aid or the Lego version of tabletop because that's the name that everybody associates with this hobby, and it's the rule set that everybody associates with it. And it makes it so that it's very difficult sometimes to see other systems and see how they work. So you could change D&D dramatically, but once you did change it, would you still be playing D&D, or would you be playing something else? Does that answer your question?
Very well.
Okay.
So, I stole this question from you.
Okay.
But I figured since you were asking both of us, you would want it asked of yourself.
Sure, we're probably going to have some overlap in our interview questions.
Tell us your tabletop role-playing game origin story.
The origin story. I was 10 years old, and we live, and still do, in a very small town. And at the time, 10 years old was 1986. And I had never heard of Dungeons & Dragons. It had actually been out for about 10 years at that point. It came out, I think, 77, if I recall correctly. So it was 9 or 10 years old. But I hadn't really heard of it. We didn't have a lot of television back then. There was no such thing as the internet. And it just wasn't a thing. And then one day I was home, me and my brother, and my parents were gone. There was a babysitter that was there, and I was drawing. I was an avid artist at the time, and I was drawing these animal people. I had this whole thing where I was drawing a cat person with armor and a dog person with a sword, and just trying to draw animals as people with armor and equipment and that sort of thing. And I think I got all that from cartoons. I had my favorite toys at the time were Battle Beast, so that was probably where a lot of that came from. But the babysitter happened to mention, his name was Sean. He's a real cool guy, and he saw it and he goes, those look like Dungeons and Dragons characters. And I said, I don't know what that is, so explain that. And because I felt I was a little tiny perfectionist, and I felt a little bit offended that something else looked like my thing, even though I was blatantly copying Battle Beasts. But he explained to me in a very short way. He just said, well, Dungeons and Dragons is this game that I play with my friends, and where you create a character and you just make up what they do, and you roll dice and you can fight monsters and get treasure. And that was his whole explanation of it. And I immediately stopped what I was doing. I told him to, I was like, okay, hold on. And then I grilled this poor kid, who was much older than me, grilled him for hours on every aspect of the rules, of the setting, of the names of monsters, and what sort of books were these, what kind of dice were they. Grilled him really until my mom and his mom came back, and he was freed from my attention. And then after that, I stole all of the D6s out of every board game that we owned, out of Monopoly and Sorry and all those, all the D6s, so that I could start making my own game, because I didn't have any of the books or know how to get any of the books even. The closest bookstore when we lived where we were in 1986, the closest bookstore was probably 40 minutes away and didn't carry those. So the next day I drew a map of a forest with trails running through it and little places like a fairy spring and a unicorn glade and a dragon's cave and a place where there was a sword sticking out of a stump. And I was just pulling things out of different stories and cartoons and whatnot that I'd ever read or watched. And then we sat around, me and my friend Ryan at the time, and still at the time, sat around, and we didn't know the rules, so we just started making things up as we went, rolling just D6s, because that's all we had, and we just used that map and no miniatures and no real rule set until later on we got access to the games. But that's my origin. That's how I started everything. And I haven't really dropped that passion since then. I've always been interested in this.
So based on that, do you have a favorite character in any game that you really wish you would have played longer, maybe didn't get a big enough chance to play him, had all these plans for somebody that you really liked, and then they were cut short because the campaign ended?
Character-wise, that's a tough question for me, because I do think that I often was the dungeon master. So there's a lot of games that I remember where I really liked the game I was running. The characters that I've played, of all of the ones that I've ever played, I would say my favorite, there was, and it's silly because I couldn't tell you what his name was, but there was a dwarf fighter that I played that I went down the path of securing a castle and hiring retainers and making sure that the land around the castle was clear and safe for my retainers and the people that live nearby. I went super far into, at a time when there really wasn't those rules in the game built in, of being like a lord of a castle and kind of leaning into that role playing. But I don't know what his name was, but that I enjoyed that.
Was that one of mine?
No, I think it was Todd that was running it. Okay. And
I don't remember that.
It was when we lived above the post office.
Okay.
I think Todd ran it. But it was, and I know we made it up to 9th level-ish. But I had cleared, and I don't think that was the direction he was planning on the game to go. We had cleared this castle as a quest. There was an old abandoned fort out in the middle of nowhere in the Forgotten Realms, a little ways away from Waterdeep, I think it was. And I had gone out with the other people that were playing, which I think at the time it was my wife Jen, and there was a person, Adrian, I think, was playing with us at the time, and Todd was running it. and we cleared this castle, and then I think Todd expected us to move on and do other things. And I was like, well, no. If the castle's clear, then we're going to fix it up, and we're going to live here, and this will be our base of operations. And it just kind of spiraled from there. But I really enjoyed that aspect. It felt like that character had more of a story than most of mine. And I've got lots of characters that I've done lots of things with, but I just really enjoyed that aspect of being able to go, okay, I've got like I knew the names of all my retainers. I had villagers that were reporting to me, and there were no rules in the game for like how much money do you have to spend in order to keep your castle going. How much money do you get from the vassals that live nearby and are selling their crops, and I think I really was putting Todd to the test and trying to come up with rules on the fly for those sort of things, but I had a blast.
Hey folks, Guy here. This concludes my interview. Thanks for listening to our crazy ramblings, and please check out Alyn and Ryan's interviews.
This has been Gen XP. Thanks for listening. Catch you next week.